I had to attend to something. Yes, like I want to call this agent or something, but don't know if it's agent. But I had to attend to something. Um, I wanted to find out, right? Do you people have any questions related to what we have covered thus far? A reminder that we've we've well, we just wrapped up a discussion that was centered around prioritization, requirements prioritization. We discovered when we were going through the IEEE standard 830-1998 that there's typically, as we are describing or using Annex A.5 when we are describing a feature, um, in the description itself, we are supposed to indicate the priority level associated with the feature. It's expected that we do that. And in fact, I'm just going to pop up. We discovered that we can do that. And what we realized is that prioritization is actually a near exact science, right? A near exact science. And what's even more intriguing is that there's a whole range of techniques that we can leverage when we're prioritizing requirements, right? So priority. I don't know if I'll be able to find the priority here, but it's it turns out that there's a whole range of techniques that we can leverage. We can use simple ranking. We can use sophisticated ranking techniques. Like for instance, we discussed what can be done by way of using the analytical hierarchy process theory in pairwise comparisons, um, and, uh, and something else we realized was that we can use fancy things like the Moscow technique, for instance, right, where we're just tagging. We are providing tags or classifications associated with different requirements here. Um, what else did we do? Well, we also looked at how we can take advantage of pairwise comparisons here. We can use so-called kernel analysis where we are tagging we're tagging uh, we're tagging these requirements based on a unique classification of the factors or the features, right? Is it a very basic factor that is required? Something that if is missing will result in customers not using the software, for instance, right? And all those things. Anyways, um, uh, so we did that, and I don't know if there's any questions here about this, but I thought now would be a perfect opportunity for us um, to have a discussion centered around validation of requirements. So it's one thing for us to gather the requirements, and to perhaps to a certain extent um, to prioritize the requirements. Before, remember this document that we're creating at the end, the SRS document here serves as a contract, we said, and so before we can actually present this contract to the customer, to the client, one of the things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to validate, right, and check the things we've compiled. And this is extremely important because the last thing you want to do here is to get into a situation where you mindlessly agree to things that are a bit vague here, right? Like somebody tells you, we want you to build an application that, because right now in Zambia, buying things online is difficult. If I want to purchase things on, let's say, Alibaba or something, or AliExpress or eBay, I have got to use, is that thing? If I want to purchase things on, let's say, AliExpress or something, or eBay, I'll just use AliExpress. I have got to use either my debit card, or I have got to use, I don't know if PayPal is allowed still. It's been a while since I did this. I do have an account though. We want you to build a piece of software. We want to act as an interface between AliExpress and people that are in Zambia. And so what we want you to do is build our platform in such a way that users can pay using mobile money, MTN money, and and Airtel money. You want to be very careful what you agree to here. The idea behind this example is you have got to validate and check. Is it realistically possible for you to implement that feature? In some instances, it may be possible. You may have the skill set and the expertise, but it's just not possible, right? It's not feasible for you to implement that feature. I'll be the first one to tell you that last time I checked, actually, it's quite a mission here. I mean, you can probably come up with a payment gateway here, but there are legal implications and stuff, which is why it's insanely difficult to implement a feature that facilitates the exchange of currencies or money or something outside the jurisdiction of a particular country, right? It's a mission. We had trouble when we were, I must say this here, when we had a conference last year. It was an international conference where we had people from outside. Now, the only payment method we had was, here are the bank details, deposit, and then when you deposit, send us proof of payment. We'll confirm the transaction. But we constantly had people reach out to us and tell us, wait a minute, do you not have a PayPal feature? It was hard, right? We ended up interacting with an entity called TechPay Zambia or something, and they were charging insane money, right? Because of the payment gateway or something like that. It was insane. But anyway, so hence the reason why we're having this discussion centered around validation of requirements. We have got to validate them. We have got to review the requirements. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this is that this whole process, right? This whole process, this whole process is typically done in consultation with the client or the customer. There's a bit of back and forth. So validation. So really, requirements validation and checking involves, demonstrating that the requirements that have been collected actually define the system that the customer really wants. That's a crucial thing that validation says, right? You want to demonstrate to the client that the requirements that have been gathered are an actual representation of what the client wants. The other argument that can be presented here is, and we've discussed this, is this fact that usually anomalies associated with requirements will usually results in very, very high costs, right? So this notion that if you end up in a situation where you build a system that is not an accurate representation of what the client wants, you end up wasting more money, because imagine a situation where you are building let's say a MTN to PayPal feature or something like that, and you gather the requirements, right? You come up with a design, assuming it's a waterfall model. You write the code here, and then you realize after your testing here, right, that wait a minute, we missed out something very important. Well, first, what you have to appreciate is the fact that all of these different phases take time, right? Because they take time, you're obviously paying people money, right? The people that are working on these different tasks. And so if you realize after testing here that you did something wrong or you didn't capture the requirements comprehensively, obvious what this means is you're going to have to repeat the same phases over again. So it's like, if you think about paying somebody relative to the amount of time they're spending, right? You're paying somebody 200 kwacha, or let's just say 100 kwacha per hour, and they're spending 2 hours on requirements, 3 hours on requirements. Maybe they spend 10 hours on implementation and 5 hours on testing. In the first loop, it's like, in fact, this is 10 plus 5, 15. This is like 20 or something, right? So it's like you're paying them 2,000 kwacha the first time. If you realize that there was something wrong with the requirement and they're going to spend right about the same amount of time, it's like you're paying them twice. So it's expensive, right? Which is why what you want to do is, right during requirements engineering, you want to get things right? So that you cut down on the high costs associated with requirements errors. The argument we are making in point number 2 is that requirements errors are expensive. And so requirements validation is an extremely important part of the overall implementation process of software. Okay. Again, we're saying here that fixing a requirement error after delivery can cost up to 100 times the cost of fixing an implementation error. Okay. So really, we see here that as part of validation and checking, some of the things that we're doing here is we are looking at validating the requirements. In other words, we want to ask the important question: does the system provide the functionalities which best support the customer needs? Those are some of the questions we're asking. We're also looking at consistency, right? Are there any requirements conflicts? If you remember, I highlighted the fact that typically you'd have requirements, a lot of requirements conflicts when you have multiple stakeholders, right, that may have conflicting requirements, right? So you are checking against those, right? Are the requirements complete? So are all the functionalities required by the customer included? Have you included everything? And usually what this means is you get an explicit response from the client. Here is the SRS document. Read it. As an organization, we're going to have a meeting and we want you to confirm, sign. You must sign and endorse the fact that everything has been captured, right? And you want to be realistic as well, right? Can the requirements be implemented given the available budget and technology? Feasibility, MTN to PayPal. Do you have people on your team that are able to work towards that integration? If you don't, what are the implications of outsourcing that, right? Are you in a position where you can find or you can subcontract a different company to help you with that? If that's the case, do you have the budget, right, to do that? You know, is it possible for you to implement a feature using the technology that you have or something? You understand this? And then also verifiability, right? Can you actually check these requirements? You've got to structure or phrase these requirements in such a way that you can actually check them, right? Validation and check. So these are some of the things, right? The activities that you perform as part of validation and checking of requirements. Now, it turns out that there are a number of techniques or approaches that you can take advantage of for you to validate and check these requirements. The beauty with software is software development, software engineering has been around for quite some time now, a couple of decades now. And because of that, people have perfected the art or the process of doing some of these things. Yeah. So we can ride on what people have already done here. So we see here that you can take advantage of for you to validate and check the requirements. You can use technical requirements reviews, right? Right. So you are manually analyzing the requirements one at a time. My personal favorite, really. Or you can take advantage of what we introduce as prototyping, right? Yeah. So you build a prototype and then you expose it to the client with the goal of trying to validate and check the requirements. And then obviously, if you're leveraging, let's say, test-driven development, for instance, you can take advantage of your test cases that you'd have generated here, right? So using the test cases to check the requirements or to validate your requirements. I don't want to focus on requirements reviews here, right? So it turns out that ideal when you're leveraging requirements reviews here, the idea is you want to make sure that you have regular reviews here as you are getting started with requirements engineering early on in the process. And because you're conducting these reviews, there has got to be engagement coming in from both the clients and the contractor. So the entity that is developing the software and the customers for whom the software is being developed. Okay. These reviews can be formal, right? Where you have like some output at the end, or it can be informal here. The key thing maybe to point out here is that whether it's informal or formal, what's important is that there should be two-way communication between the clients and the contractor here, right? Early on in the process. And really, when you're leveraging requirements reviews, some of the key things that you're checking for, the same things we were talking about here, right? We include things like verifiability, right? You're checking if the requirements are comprehensive. Can you trace the requirements? How do they come up, right? Why is it that they're appearing? Adaptability, right? Can you change the requirements? Are you in a position where you can change these requirements without adversely impacting or substantially impacting other requirements, right? Now, I'm going to use an example of a review defect checklist as it appears from Wiggers and Beatty's classic book. Now, this is a book that I refer to extensively, especially when we've been covering requirements engineering, right? So both elicitation and specification. It's a classic, actually. And I think there's part of design, the discussion of design, which uses the book itself. And if you look at the checklist by Wiggers and Beatty here, they have various aspects that they look out for, right? So there's a completeness checklist, right? So the checklist for completeness will have a series of questions that will assess to what extent the requirements are complete. You also check for the correctness of the requirements, right? It's a checklist. You check for quality attributes, right? Organization and traceability, and then any additional issues. Now, if you look at this thing, right, the idea behind this, by the way, is a checklist is simply that. It's like you would typically, in case you're wondering how you would use something like this, the idea behind a checklist is you would, let's say, create a simpler form. And I think I will share a template for the checklist as well. It would be good exercise here. You'd say, just see if I can find what we're looking for here, which is this. So it's like as part of completeness, right? You sit down with a client. This is bad. I just remember something. You sit down with a client and you have this sort of checklist, right? You expose them to the SRS document, and then you sit down together, and you can do this feature by feature, preferably, right? And it's like for each feature, kind of making this simple here, but it's meant to help us understand, right? And I don't know how best you could probably do this here. Maybe you could say, this would be nice here. Function requirement 1, function requirement 2. This is how I would do it, I guess. Function requirement 3 or something. You come up with something like this. Yeah. And then you'd say this is completeness. And then you have a series of questions associated with. I want to add just maybe an additional aspect here so that this thing is a lot clearer, right? I just remembered something. Let's see here. Okay. I guess this helps put the point across here, right? So it's correctness. And then you'll have these other aspects, right? That's the idea. So it's like for each function requirement, you're asking yourselves important questions like for function requirement number 2. Does the requirement address, a known, do the requirements address all known customer system needs, right? That's the essence of a checklist. It's like you can view this as being a response to yes or no questions, right? Is any needed information missing? So in other words, you're going through, for completeness, you go through this series of questions. If the answer is no, then you revisit the requirements to try and see exactly how best you can alter it so that the response to the question becomes a yes. And so you notice that the series of questions associated with completeness are clearly framed in such a way that you are truly checking that the requirements are complete, right? Do the requirements address all the customer system needs? Is there any information that is missing? If it's missing, why is it missing? Is it missing because there's pending input from the client or the customer? In which case you say to be discussed or something. You have to explicitly indicate these things, right? So that you move ahead here. Have you identified any sort of algorithms, right? Linked to the functional requirements. Have you identified all of them that you're going to be using here? Are all external, hardware, software, and communication interfaces defined? Now, what you begin to notice here, I don't know if you've been able to kind of notes here. What you begin to notice is that what you begin to notice is that what you begin to notice here, this is kind of interesting. I don't know if you've picked up on this. Have you noticed that some of these questions are actually, I don't know if you guys are good at picking out the dots here. If you look at question number 4, are all external hardware, software, and communication interfaces defined? You see where this is coming from? You remember this discussion? Hello? You guys should be serious, right? I don't know. I'm going to go back here. Double back. Somewhere in our IEEE template, we had this. External interface requirements, right? User interfaces, software interfaces, hardware interfaces, communications interfaces. Right? This is where these things are coming from. So this is not, there's a connection here between what we've been discussing and like what we are specifically checking for here. Is expected behavior documented for all anticipated error conditions? This is the reason why, if you remember, when we were looking at this SI document PDF, when I was showcasing an example of the Zema SRS document, do you remember how we had this? We're checking here. Is the expected behavior documented for all anticipated error conditions? Well, our use case flow here tells us that for normal flow, this is what happens. If there are errors, exceptions, this is what happens. Other alternative flows, right? So we are defining everything. Do you understand this? Completeness. Do the requirements provide an adequate basis for design and testing, right? So is there a clear link between how we can derive a software design document from the requirements? Is the implementation priority for each requirement included? Right? A requirement is only going to be complete according to this review defect checklist if you explicitly indicate this thing here. This. If you explicitly indicate the priority. So for each requirement, our checklist is checking, have we indicated the implementation priority for each requirement? If we haven't, then we revisit the document, the SRS document in this case, so that we include it. Is a requirement in scope for the project or the release or the iteration? Right? In other words, are you working on, is the requirement tied to the scope itself, or is it something that is outside of the scope? You want to be very careful with scope creep, right? Sometimes in the process of interacting with your client, you just agree to, yes, we can do this. It's an easy implementation. Well, it's not part of the scope of the project. So why would we want to waste time, right? Yeah. So really, these are, if we're using this sort of checklist, these are the questions that we'll be asking, right? um, the requirements will only be complete if we tick yes to all of these things here. Hope this is making sense. And then we see here that in terms of correctness, the things that we are looking for here, right, can be identified by answering a series of questions as well, according to Wiggers and Beatty, right? You'll be asking questions like, are there any requirements conflict? So if you're looking at a specific requirement here, does it conflict with any other existing requirements? If it does, you've got to address the conflicts. Are the requirements written in a clear manner? Are they concise? Right? Have you confirmed that there's no ambiguity in terms of how you are phrasing the requirements? Are you using grammatically correct language? And this question is important because remember, there's a portion of the requirements that is tailored to your customer, right? The user requirements. So you've got to be written in natural language, notation in such a way that your clients are able to clearly understand what you've written. Is each requirement verifiable, right? Can you actually test it to prove that it's actually been implemented when the time comes, right? Are there any specified error messages? Are any specified error messages clear and meaningful? So this will be in instances where you've included under exception here. If there are error messages, are they clear enough? Are the requirements actually requirements and not constraints or solutions? Sometimes, if you remember, we made mention of the fact that you could accidentally lump your constraints or your conditions, right, non-functional requirements, as part of the actual functional requirements. You have to make sure that that is not the case. And then more importantly, you notice here that as part of correctness, we are checking that the requirements are technically feasible. You can actually implement them. You can translate them into code. It's not always the case. So you notice here, completeness, we're checking for completeness, correctness, and then we start looking at the quality attributes. Now, the moment you start looking at the quality attributes here, your checklist is specifically focusing on what we introduce as non-functional requirements. And again, if you're paying attention, what you begin to notice is that our checklist, as it relates to quality attributes and to a certain extent organization and traceability, and perhaps any additional issues, actually can be linked to the section of our IEEE template that speaks to things like these things here. Section 6, right? Section 6, where we're looking at usability, performance, security, safety, right? These are non-functional requirements. So anyway, the series of questions you include in your checklist include things like, are all usability, performance, security, and safety objectives properly specified? In other words, you're going to section 6 and you're checking, is it comprehensive enough? Have you included all the non-functional requirements for each of those different categories? If you're building a piece of software where performance largely relies on response time, have you actually included that? If it transcends response time and you have to include other compute resources like memory usage, for instance, and processing power required, have you included all those details? Are other quality attributes documented? Yeah, those that fall outside of the obvious ones. In other words, there are other quality attributes documented. It speaks to this section here. Yeah, we have under quality attributes usability, performance, security, safety, and then there's 6.x, which is others. Anyhow, in other words, what we're doing is our requirements checklist from BT and Wiggers and BT rather is latching on to our IEEE standard. If you're paying attention here, and then are the time critical functions identified? Is there any timing criteria specified for all these time critical functions? Have internationalization and localization issues been adequately addressed? Sure, you're building this application, but can it be used in Malawi or in Bosnia or something like that? Are all quality requirements measurable? Usually very tricky, right? Because we highlighted this notion that quality attributes are difficult to measure. But fortunately for us, we can take advantage of techniques or advances in a field of computing called human-computer interaction, right? And what you begin to notice when you start studying human-computer interaction is that there are predefined methods that you can leverage to measure these quality attributes. So instruments that you can use, a whole range of them. We are going to look at these as part of, if I look at usability tests, and I look at, I like referring to, let's see if I can find software. There are certain United States-based websites or entities that NASA is special actually, that have done extensive work as it relates to how you measure usability. And some of the most widely used usability tests have come out of there. But I'll give you an example of a system usability scale actually. In part because this is probably one of the most widely used techniques in students that I work with. They'll use the SAS questionnaire really. So if you're looking at measuring usability, there's an instrument that you can use, right, called the system usability scale, and this is predefined. So the items that you have in your instrument here collectively will help you measure usability. So in as much as usability is subjective, but when you use a standard metric like this, it becomes a lot easier for you to justify, right? So in other words, are all quality requirements measurable? And then we see that as part of the checklist for organization and traceability, you're asking questions like, are the requirements organized in a logical and accessible manner, right? Have you clustered requirements that are related together? It's part of the reason why, if you look at the example I was giving for Zambia, for instance, we are organizing these requirements in such a way that they are grouped by feature, right? If you look at this, all of these distinct requirements here are associated with these 4 requirements here, are associated with the same feature. After we gathered the requirements, we clustered them together like so. Do you understand this? Anyway, are all cross references to other requirements and documents correct? Usually when you're presenting these requirements, there'll be a connection with other requirements. So what you do is, in your document, you have references, and I hope there's an example of the reference here. Maybe not, but you have examples of references here. Say this requirement is related to this, or this feature is related to this feature or something. You have a cross reference, and usually a cross references can easily be incorporated into your documentation here when you have a unique way of identifying these requirements, right? So if you can uniquely identify these requirements, it becomes a lot easier for you to cross-reference. And then are all requirements written in a consistent and appropriate level of detail? Consistency here, because usually you have a lot of people, participating in the, I guess, drafting of the SRS document. So the question is, are you presenting them in a consistent manner? Observe, if I go to the very first feature here, which is system feature number 1, 3.1.1 description, 3.1.2 stimulus/response sequence, 3.1.3 function requirements, 3.1.4 use cases tied to the feature, right? If I go to the very next feature, I'll notice that there's a consistency in the pattern. So this is what you're checking for. And usually you want to check for this because different people participate in the drafting of these requirements. But if you're dealing with an organization whose maturity level is somewhat advanced, you really won't have to worry about this because you know that they're going to be consistent, but you still have to verify. Okay? Is each requirement uniquely or correctly labeled? Right? Each requirement has a unique tag. We can easily identify it by that unique identifier. Is each functional requirement traced back to its origin, right? Yes, we can trace our requirements because we are keeping track of who was working on these, when it was last updated, and all those things. And then any additional issues in this checklist, what you're doing really is you are looking at things like, are any use cases and process flows missing? So in as much as like your these process flow diagrams are design artifacts, there are instances where you may warrant the use of these design artifacts in your SRS document. So you're checking. In other words, you're going to your analysis models annex section of the document and checking or verifying that nothing is missing from here. If I come to here, these analysis models, yeah, appendix B in this Zema example, it's like, well, we see that the complete use case diagram is missing, right? Or we cannot see any uh, activity diagram included that outlines a critical business process tied to the piece of software that you're building or something like that, you know. Or they haven't indicated a comprehensive list of reports, right? A comprehensive list of reports that the system is going to be generating. You guys, you have got to be, you know, serious about this thing here. And then questions like, are any alternative flows, exceptions, and other information missing from the use cases? And guess what? This version of the Zema uh, is this version of the Zema example here is a classic one, right? Are there any, observe, in the use case flow, I'm going to come here. Are there any alternative flows, exceptions, or other information missing? In this particular case, we'd say, yes, alternative flow is missing here. Exceptions, well, it's missing, but it's indicated as to be discussed. So these are the things that you're checking for. Another way of thinking about what you're doing as part of, I don't know if this was immediately clear when I was walking us through this, but I must explicitly state this. What you're doing is this checklist is meant to help you verify the document. So for you to answer these questions, this document must be available. You can only ascertain whether there are any alternative flows, exceptions, and other information missing from the use case if you have this document prepared. Surprise, surprise, right? Are all the business rules identified? Are there any missing visual models that would provide clarity or completeness? I would venture to argue here that in this Zema example, it would have been nice if we had sequence diagrams, although there's a separate SD document, or supposed to be a separate SD document for that. Okay, and then are all necessary report specifications present and complete? Reporting, right? In our case, what we did for the reporting part is we have, I hope, oh my goodness, I think we have something here. What? Oh wow. Maybe we, yeah, reports, data requirements. I think we should have a section for reports. Wow. What? There we go. So it's like in this particular case, right? Our necessary report specification present and complete. There we go. They're present here, right? We have a table that lists all the reports that will be generated by the platform itself. Boom. Okay. I want to pause here and kind of ask if there are any questions before we proceed. I would much rather we finalize our discussion. Requirements change here. Yes, Mr. Kundwani, sir. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry?
The questions in the checklist, are they just specifically for the project or are they also examinable?
What do you mean examinable?
Like, can we be asked to list the questions for the checklist when doing a checklist, or is it just there to help us with the project or guide us through the project?
You will be asked on everything that we've covered. So yes, the answer is yes. Thank you for telling us that. Maybe we should ask it actually in the exam or in the test or something. So the answer is yes. But nobody's going to, I mean, nobody's going to say, list all questions that you can ask, right? For you to, using the Wiggers and BT checklist, for you to check for completeness of requirements. Nobody's going to ask that. But maybe we can ask what are some of the things that you check for when you're looking at verifying or reviewing correctness or completeness. Do you understand this? Anyway, so I mean, it's important for us to talk about this important point. We already discussed it briefly, but we're going to revisit it because we had a discussion about coping with change, if you remember, at a time when we hadn't really had a comprehensive discussion of requirements engineering, right? But we motivated for why requirements change. You know, like your business rules will change, your technical environment may change. You're working on this project over a 1 year period, and initially you're like, we're going to be using Apache, and then somewhere down the line, or we're going to be using JBoss. Somewhere down the line, you realize, well, Tomcat is the best, right? Technology environments change. Oh, you start a project and we are working with Ubuntu 20.04, and then all of a sudden you have Ubuntu 24.04 as being the long-term support version currently available. You know, so things change. But um, in some other instances, the people that you're developing this software for may impose this change, right? Because of organizational changes or perhaps budgetary constraints. We already had a discussion for why requirements change here, right? But what's important here is to remind ourselves of the way these requirements will tend to evolve, right? You initially have a situation where you have an initial understanding of the problem, where you derive your initial requirements. After you derive your initial requirements, as you're actually executing the project, you have a situation where your understanding of the problem may change, or your understanding may be influenced by these changes, right? The reasons for change that we already highlighted here. After which, you have a revised list of requirements, changed requirements. And we see that this process actually occurs over time. This process is linked to what we introduced as uncertainty. If you remember, we had that nice graph here, is it? Requirements uncertainty, where at the very beginning, you're quite uncertain about what you're doing. And then as you're inching closer to the truth here, or to what you're looking for, things become a lot clearer here. And so because of this, it turns out that it becomes important for us to seriously think about, and I'm wondering here, I think we can finish this. It becomes important for us to seriously think about how best we can manage these requirements. Because if you've compiled a set of requirements and you anticipate that they're going to change over time, there's got to be an effective way of managing this change, right? So requirements management is a process of managing changing requirements during the requirements engineering process and system development, so that there's a traceable record, right, of these changes. Now we see really, I think we're going to a stage where we appreciate that in some instances, new requirements will emerge as the system is being developed. In addition, new requirements will also emerge after the system has been deployed. It's an afterthought. We realize that this is a really nice system, but it would be nice if we had this feature or something. We got to keep track of those things. Okay. And so the idea behind requirements change here is it enables you to keep track of these individual requirements, and more importantly, make sure that you're keeping track of the links amongst the requirements that are dependent on each other. in addition, it's important to highlight the fact that you have to go through a normal change request procedure within your organization, right? For you to change these requirements or something. Okay. I don't know if there's a part where I'm talking about the two here, but maybe not. Yeah, anyway. Requirements management establishes requirements management decisions that you've got to grapple with here is things like you want to make sure that each requirement is uniquely identified. If you're keeping track of changes to a requirement, obviously it makes sense that the requirements are sort of like uniquely identified, right? So that it's a lot easier for you to cross-reference. Usually there's a interdependence that exists amongst the different requirements. So it becomes a lot easier to maintain those links if you can uniquely identify requirements. Some other important things that you've got to take into account as part of requirements management is this notion that you've got to formalize the process of making change or effecting changes. Right? So there's got to be like a formalized change management process, which will ultimately outline the activities which will involve assessing the impact and cost of the change. We want you to make modifications to a requirement associated with I don't know if I had it here, but the requirement associated with our MTN to PayPal thing. Well, what are the implications, right, on what we are doing? If we are to adjust this change here, what are the implications on the cost, on the timeline, on all those things, right? And then also you have to obviously consider any traceability policies. So if you're making a change, you've got to ascertain to what extent this change will affect these other requirements, right? If there's a dependence on other requirements, the moment you change this requirement, there's a possibility that it may affect the requirements that depend on it, right? So the idea behind traceability policies is they'll set out how exactly you're going to assess the impact of those dependencies. And then obviously, it's important here to mention the fact that this requirements management process is best done effectively when you're using a computer-aided software engineering tool. Now, it can be a very sophisticated application if you want. I know of people that have used tools like Jira, for instance, right? Or you can use a simple spreadsheet, right? So you're compiling this spreadsheet, which will perhaps have a list of all the requirements IDs and the features they're tied to, including any potential changes, right? So you just use your simple spreadsheet for you to do that. Or you can use some sophisticated application. In the past, I've used a tool called let's see here, requirements management. If I check, I think it's is it Stack Overflow? .com or something. Free and open source requirements management software. There's quite a number of tools that you can use here. What you begin to notice, by the way, is that because there's a lot that is involved in software development, what some people do is they will skip some of these phases, right? So don't really prioritize I've used RecView. I think in the past I've demonstrated how to use RecView, I believe. What else have I used here? I'm trying to see if I can find doorstop. I think there should be an Ubuntu version of doorstop as well. But the key thing here is if you look at just the simple screenshots of these computer-aided software engineering tools, you will notice that they have all these important aspects we're talking about, right? If you look at the outline here, these alpha numeric codes here are unique, is it? Meaning that this particular example or the screenshot, you're showcasing that these would be like the unique IDs associated with the different requirements, right? And then you have details to do with the requirements. To the far right here, you notice that we are specifying relationships that exist, right, between this requirement and other existing requirements. Yeah, links rec 16 in this particular case. Anyway, so this is what you're doing. But here's the thing. You can also use, so it's a spreadsheet application, but you can also use the plain old Word document, right? And maybe just version it, right? So you can take advantage of version control systems, software tools like Git, for instance, or Mercurial. And we have a discussion of configuration management very, very soon. The other question that you would have to answer here when dealing with requirements management is you've got to make a decision, right, on whether you should go ahead and effect a change, a proposed change to a requirement. And it turns out that before you can do that, you have got to go through some recommended systematic process where you first of all do your problem analysis and change specification. So you analyze, right, the proposed change. So somebody submits a change request. Typically, there's a change request form that you fill out. We want to make changes to this requirement. What you're doing is you're analyzing the proposed change, and you're doing that to check if it's valid. You respond to the person who requested for a change with feedback, obviously, right? This feedback could be you want sorry about that. I briefly lost my connection there. But what we're talking about, we're discussing the workflow that you would adopt if you're wanting to decide on whether you should accept a change or not, right? So you analyze the request, and then you undergo what's called change analysis and costing, right? In essence, you want to determine the impact that the proposed change is going to have. And then if you feel it's okay to proceed with the proposed change here, you implement the change itself. And the moment you implement the change, you have got to make sure that you make necessary changes in the requirements document, obviously. And obvious corresponding changes to other documents that may be dependent on the SRS document in this case. So the system design document, any implementation specific documents, for instance, right? Yeah, so that's it, right? The workflow that you go through. And the summary is as follows, right? You identify a problem which warrants a change. You do your problem analysis and you come up with a change specification. Typically, what you're doing is you're analyzing the identified problem through a change request form. You undergo change analysis and costing to determine the effect that that change will have on the cost and on the time. And then you implement the change. Once you implement the change, you end up with a revised set of requirements. All right, listen. I didn't want to leave this off for the next interaction we're going to have. A reminder that what we've discussed in this lecture series is the formal specification, is it requirement specification itself, which ultimately will result in a requirement specification document. We had a discussion, a very lengthy discussion of how we represent functional requirements and non-functional requirements. For the most part, our discussion was centered around a pre-existing template and based on an IEEE standard. And we realized that this is a process that involves quite a number of things. Is prioritization, for instance, requirements review, right, where you're checking for things like correctness and completeness and all those things. So the next time we meet, we're going to start looking at software design. And specifically, our discussion is going to be centered around studying the unified modeling language. I want to pause here and ask if there are any questions. Yeah, that's unfortunate. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, I'm attending a workshop. I'm attending a workshop between tomorrow and Thursday and Friday. So I wanted to propose if we can move the Thursday class. I hope I will not be very tired here because the event is taking place in Chongwe, right? I can manage the Friday one still at 18, I think, but I wanted to propose that the Thursday class be moved to, and I can't move things over the weekend because there's some urgent personal issues I've got to attend to, sadly. So I have a proposal. We can either have, my proposal is we have class at 18 hours on Thursday, 19 hours. I think I would have been back by then. Now I'm even tempted to say we can always have class as well tomorrow. So we move our Thursday class to tomorrow. I know that would be manageable because this event is only taking place on Thursday and Friday. So I'll ask that you discuss this as a group, and then I'll reach out to Mr. Muna and Ms. Violet for kind of like feedback here. Are there any questions? Yes, Ms. Violet.
Yes, so I wanted to say that tomorrow we have classes from I think 15 to 18. So maybe if the suggestion is for tomorrow, then in the late afternoon it won't be possible because we're having a lot of classes at that time.
Okay, that's fine. Well, let's. Can I ask that? Are you able to tell us whether Thursday 18 or 19 is fine? Or Thursday? Sorry, no, Thursday can't be. Yeah. Okay, if that's the case, that's fine. We can. I want to propose that we move this to maybe the other week then, the makeup class. Because I have to be honest. I'm pretty certain I'm not going to be. I'll have to come back to Lusaka from Chongwe, right? And when we end at 17, I don't think I'll be back I may be back by 18. But on Thursday, unfortunately, this class here has been moved to 18 hours. This 4792. But we'll come up with a plan anyway. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'll see you on Friday. But I'll be in touch with the crew course reps to try and find out when I may have time over the weekend, maybe, or something. Thank you. Bye.